And good morning and welcome if you're just joining us. I will give you a couple of seconds to log in and load up. Hopefully you can see us and hear me loud and clearly. If you have any issues, please let me know in the chat. Thank you, Vicky. And we're still loading in, but we do have a very packed agenda, so I'm keen to push on. So welcome to Make UK Manufacturers Organisation's webinar, Freedom Day and Employer's Guide. There are over 900 manufacturers booked on to join us this morning, so thank you to those that are just logging in and joining us now. We're really pleased to provide guidance in this session because over the last few days and weeks we've been hearing serious concern from our members about the lifting of government's COVID-19 restrictions and how manufacturers are managing this and preventing any impact on their recovery from the pandemic. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Chris Cork and I'm one of the regional membership managers here at Make UK. And we put together a packed agenda of expert guest speakers for you today. In the first instance, we shall be hearing from Make UK's Chief Executive and our Policy Director on the sector's response, our work with government and the national media, before hearing directly from a government official on the business guidance, a Make UK employment law expert, and the Health and Safety Executive on practically implementing such guidance and managing the overall situation. But in terms of today's housekeeping, we will be recording the session as we are now, but please appreciate the changing nature of today's discussion for those that do re-watch this over the next few days. We do not have dedicated time for a Q&A session today, but thank you to all the pre-submitted questions we've had, and we have had quite a number, and we have used them to guide today's presentations for you. We will also be using the polling feature of Zoom to get your feedback on the current situation at your businesses. And if you do have any direct comments and responses to what our speakers say over the next hour and 15 minutes, then please do use the chat function, which you can find on the menu at the bottom of your screen. This session is taking place to a slightly extended time until 12:45, but after that we'll be able to share the materials presented and the recording and follow-up information from Make UK directly with you as well. But without further ado, I'm very pleased to be able to hand over to Stephen Phipson, Make UK's Chief Executive, who will be able to provide an overview of the sector's response to Freedom Day and what we're doing about it on behalf of the sector with government. So Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for everyone who's joining today's webinar. I'm really pleased to see so many of you join this extremely important and indeed very topical webinar today. The past 12 to 18 months have been extremely challenging for manufacturers, but we've also seen the manufacturing industry shine, and it's been acknowledged by employers, the public and government alike. But what the pandemic has shown is that just how critical and how crucial the sector is to the UK. Together, we have worked to keep plants and factories open throughout the lockdown, ensuring that the wheels kept turning, shelves remained stocked, and our people were able to work safely. Today's webinar is about Freedom Day and what that means for your business. Monday saw the reopening of many parts of our economy. It also saw the lifting of many of the restrictions that had previously been in place. And employers across all industries received updated guidance from the Department for Business on just how to operate in this final stage of the government's roadmap. We're lucky to be joined by officials from both BEIS and the HSE today, who will no doubt talk more about this in detail. Let me start, however, on what we are hearing from our members, the insight we're picking up from the sector and what we at Make UK are doing to ensure all of your businesses and the wider manufacturing industry have the knowledge you need, not just to survive in this period of recovery, but also to thrive. When speaking to our members, it's been very clear that whilst this week marks the end to previous restrictions, the vast majority of manufacturers plan to keep some or all of those restrictions in place for the next month or so in particular. These include encouraging the use of face masks, keeping social distancing measures in place, and continuing to test employees and customers that come onto site. There remains a nervousness that whilst infection rates are still increasing, removing all these restrictions will lead to further COVID outbreaks, which we know can significantly impact a manufacturing workplace by limiting staff that's able to work on the production floor. Many manufacturers have told us that the reason why they are retaining these measures is because of the misalignment in dates of Monday's Freedom Day and the ending of the self-isolation rules for those who are double vaccinated, which many of you will know is not until the 16th of August. We have heard many stories of manufacturers who have had to close production lines because so many of their staff are self-isolating. And this isn't because they have COVID-19 symptoms, it's because their employees have been contacted either directly by NHS Track and Trace or they've been pinged on the app, the so-called pingdemic that we're experiencing at the moment. This is, of course, where things get a bit complex. As you will hear from our HR and legal advisors later, the legal duties on employers often differ depending on whether your employees have been contacted directly or pinged by the app. Later, you'll hear more on what advice we are giving to employers about that issue. We also know that manufacturers are concerned about the decision to end free lateral flow tests for employers or the funding of them. We greatly applaud government with their absolutely world-beating vaccination program, but whilst it continues to be rolled out, employers want peace of mind and on-site rapid tests can provide that. This is again particularly important when we consider the risk of an employee coming into work when they potentially have COVID-19 symptoms. During the pandemic, the rules around statutory sick pay changed so that those self-isolating can access SSP from day one and not wait until day 4. Again, you'll hear more on that later. These three themes taken together, these give us three core areas that we are discussing and lobbying government on right now. One is around bringing forward the self-isolation rule changes immediately, and we continue that discussion almost on a daily basis. Continuing the free lateral flow tests for employees is another one that we're calling for, and basically on the statutory sick pay issue, can we do that from day one, and can we continue with the arrangements we have at the moment? And we've been making this case loudly and clearly. I've had weekly meetings with the Secretary of State for Business where we've been raising this and discussing and debating the issues around it. The intelligence we've received from you, our members, formed the basis of a briefing that went to BEIS Number 10 and the Cabinet Office over the last week. And we've been raising the profile on the media too. This week alone, we've been on Sky News, ITV, lots of other broadcast media, GB News, I think was another one. And we've been on the front pages of the FT and have had significant and extensive coverage in the Times and other broadsheets and online broadcasts. We're taking your concerns seriously. We are raising them at the highest levels of government possible. We are your voice during these challenging times and will continue to be that voice. So thank you for joining us today. I know there'll be plenty of questions you have and we'll give you as many answers as we possibly can. If we can't answer them today, rest assured we'll get you the answers you need from our government interactions. So on that note, I think Verity will launch a short poll to look at the key challenges facing your business. So thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. So what we're going to do now is launch a short poll to really get a feel for what's happening in your respective businesses. And having that insight and intelligence is exactly what we need to make sure that when we are speaking to government, to ministers and to policymakers, that we're providing them with that evidence base. And hopefully what it'll also do is give you an opportunity to see what your peers are doing. So on that note, I think, Chris, I believe we're going to launch the poll. So we'll just give everyone some time. Appreciate there's some questions to read through, but if you can let us know your comments, we're going to have a little bit of discussion afterwards, and I'll give a bit more insight into what we're hearing on the ground.
So thank you to everyone filling in the poll. It's also well worth mentioning that the poll is anonymous and the results will not be shown, being able to identify anybody that's joined us. So please feel free to input your experiences on these questions.
We are getting results in now, so we'll give it another 10 or so seconds and then we'll have a bit of discussion.
And we'll give it 10 more seconds because we're still getting lots of responses. So thank you to everyone that has filled in this poll. And we'll stop there.
Okay, brilliant. So I see that the results are in now, and we're going to have a little bit of a chat about those and whether it's seeing whether it's reflecting what we've been hearing from members directly, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on that. So perhaps unsurprisingly, and what we've definitely been hearing from our members is around this lifting of restrictions, and Stephen touched upon this earlier. It may be Freedom Day, or it has maybe been Freedom Day since Monday, but what we've been hearing from a lot of our manufacturing companies is actually they want to keep those a lot of those restrictions in place. That said, I would say it varies. So a lot of companies are telling us that they will continue to undertake advanced cleaning, that they will encourage greater and more frequent personal hygiene, use of sanitizers. We then have a cohort of members who, a lot of them are telling us they will still retain social distancing, they will still encourage the use of masks, pretty much anything that doesn't actually impact quite fundamentally on production or the day-to-day running of the business. I think the only one area where perhaps we will begin to see a bit of gradual change is around the move from remote working back into the office or indeed site, as we see in manufacturing. Our sector is one that has remained open and operational during this time, but we do also know that a large number of our members have seen employees work remotely, whether that's off-site or indeed at home. And a recent Make UK survey revealed that 55% of manufacturers actually plan a return on-site into the office in the coming weeks. 43% were looking at adopting more of a hybrid way of working, of which we have vast amounts of information and insight onto, and 2% will look at keeping remote working as it was. So actually what we see is companies acting with a great deal of caution and concern, and it's back to that point that Stephen made around self-isolation. And what we've seen in these polls here is actually, I think it was around 80% had been impacted by the track or trace scheme. And that's what we are again hearing from our members, that a large number or a large proportion of staff are being told they have to self-isolate. And it's been very challenging then being able to run production lines as a result of these self-isolations. And what I think is quite concerning, and definitely something I know Stephen will be taking back to our Secretary of State meeting later today, is the fact that these self-isolation are increasing. So actually, there is that huge nervousness from manufacturers that their absence rates in the coming weeks are actually going to increase. And of course, that's going to hit on production once again. It seems then, and what we're picking up from our membership, is that many manufacturers are adopting a wait and see approach. I think that first milestone is the date Stephen alluded to, that 16th of August, which, as we will come on to later, is that all-important date where those who have been double jabbed, have their second dose of vaccines, will not have to comply with the self-isolation rules. But other companies have actually told us that if they have a summer shutdown, for example, they may wait till then to actually remove the restrictions. But on the whole, I would say the majority of our members are waiting to see what the infection rates do and are particularly looking at what's happening in their local area. They are very nervous about an outbreak of COVID in their site, in their factories, because of the potential impact and disruption it may have on their business. I think it was really pleasing to see that so many of you agree with those top 3 asks that Stephen mentioned that we are lobbying government for. These are the asks that we feel will make an immediate difference to the manufacturing industry. We're also looking for further ideas of how we can help support you, whether it's directly in how Make UK can support you, or how we can lobby government. So really interested in all of your views in the chat on what would help your business during this time. But back to those top three again, and a bit more reasons as to why that is the case. Aligning the self-isolation rules is something that I think has been dominating my email inbox for the last 2 weeks. Manufacturers are simply confused as to why these rules are waiting until the 16th of August, whereas it is supposedly Freedom Day from Monday. What we want to see is alignment, not just in messaging, but indeed policy. And I'm sure you'll hear a little bit more about that later. We also know about the concerns around sick pay. It was great that the government introduced this temporary measure to make it accessible from day one as opposed to day 4. That made sure that actually employees who may have had COVID symptoms weren't tempted into work for the fear that they won't get their sick pay till day 4. And what we want to see is this continue. We are still in pandemic mode. And what we want to ensure is that all employees feel that they can actually access statutory sick pay if they need to, should they be required to self-isolate. And then finally, on the lateral flow test, again, it's been really successful. I've seen many businesses apply this and adopt this in their sites. I've been tested when visiting some of those. We want to see that continue, at least to a point where perhaps everyone has been double vaccinated and we can lessen that use of those testings. I think the other one thing I'd finally pick up on in terms of what we're hearing now is the impact also on business travel. So, of course, we know that a large number of manufacturers regularly send their employees to the EU and indeed outside of the EU. And because of the quarantine restrictions, a lot of this has been pulled back. Now, we know that even without the pandemic, manufacturers would have had to face, a myriad of challenges with the various rules and regulations from the TCA agreement. But what we've actually seen is that companies just simply aren't sending those employees to go to buy, to win business, or to service, maintain plants and machinery because of the quarantine rules. So again, I think that's an area that we'd really appreciate your insight and intelligence on, so we can make sure we are sending those right measures to government, and also supporting you in ensuring that you can continue business as usual. But in summary, what I would say is that for the most part, manufacturers are waiting to see. It will, of course, be dependent on what your business wants to do individually, but what we are hearing from your peers, from industry, is more of a cautious approach, waiting to see whether infection rates cases do begin to come down, making sure that they can continue to run those all-important production lines. As Stephen said, we are the sector that keeps on putting food on your table and powering homes with energy and providing all of that vital PPE that kept our NHS going during this time. Now, I'm sure you've got loads more questions, particularly for our colleagues in HRL and from HSE and BEIS. So on that note, Chris, I will stop and I believe hand over to Jessica.
Yes, absolutely. And I wonder if before we move to Jessica very quickly, I know Stephen needs to leave the meeting for his next government meeting, and I'm sure he'll be able to take away that feedback, Stephen, directly to government later today. Just like to offer you a final comment before you need to just drop off the call. Caught you on mute, Stephen.
No, Chris, I'm fine. Thank you very much. I mean, it's again, the feedback will be very valuable for later today. But yes, I think we're going to collect it at the summary of this meeting. Thank you.
Brilliant. And moving on then, so we are delighted to be joined by Jessica Skilbeck, who has been working with in the heart of government on industry's business guidance and how to continue operating. So Jessica, if I can hand over to you to offer some guidance to our members on that guidance, but also what's been your role in the development of that over the last few weeks.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. Just before I get into the substance, can I just reiterate or sort of add my support to what Stephen said at the beginning, sort of the role that your sector and your members have played in ensuring that the country continues to operate through the pandemic has been fantastic, and also the role of Make UK as an organisation in providing us in government with this sort of feedback. I I hear it daily, and it's very important and useful to us as we develop policy in a sort of very fluid situation. So thank you. My name is Jessica Skilbeck, and I am Director with responsibility for the COVID response in BEIS. I'm also joined here by colleagues from Health and Safety Executive, who will talk a bit later about enforcement of the new guidance after step 4. But just to say a few things first of all, and they very much echo the points made by Stephen and Verity. So another confirmation that we are hearing the concerns of members as we go through the steps in the roadmap. So first of all, on the guidance for working safely, you will all be aware that this was published last week. And again, thank you very much to Make UK for input into that. You will have seen that it's significantly simplified from what came before, so consolidated down into 4 sets from 11 previously, covering groups of workplaces. Again, not new to you, but government is now providing guidance on what you can do to manage the risk of COVID in your workplace, rather than mandating specific steps. And the regulations that were in Parliament for the previous mandatory requirements have now expired. The one remaining obligation is, again, this won't be new to you, but is around the obligation to carry out a risk assessment in consultation with your employees, and then to consider the steps that you can take to mitigate that risk. And the guidance contains examples of things that you might want to continue doing. Some of these have been discussed already and came up in the poll in terms of people continuing with them for the time being, but things like cohorting of staff arrangements, the continued use of masks. One thing that I would want to emphasise, it has come up in relation to other sectors, is the principle of sort of house rules, the extent to which you want to go beyond the minimum requirements, not just in relation to employees, but potentially sort of visitors and customers on site. That is completely fine. It is for you to determine what you think is appropriate in your workplace. And Alex and David will say more when we come on to enforcement, but there the overall principle is that Health and Safety Executive will be returning to more of a pre-COVID approach to the general assessment of risk and the mitigation around health and safety, rather than the more specific COVID arrangements that have been in place for, you know, the last 15, 16 months. So that's what I wanted to say on guidance. I was then going to just touch on this question of isolation and the pingdemic. Now, as a country, we are making really good progress on vaccination. You've probably seen the press coverage, but we're at nearly 90% of adults having received 1 dose now, and 70% having received 2 doses. But we are also in the situation that cases of COVID are high. They're at about 40,000 a day, and they are rising. So I think the latest figures is around 40% rise on the previous 7 days. So contact tracing remains in place until the 16th of August. I completely hear you that this is one of your top 3 asks of government. I would just manage your expectations on that I think that requirement is very unlikely to change. The reason for that is that contact tracing is the last real remaining public health measure that we have in place in the situation of cases rising, since the other restrictions were released on Monday. So I fully expect that dialogue to continue with government, but all the messages that I'm hearing from Number 10 and Cabinet Office Task Force is that that is unlikely to change. We would, of course, expect transmission of cases to decrease once schools have broken up. There's a time lag associated with that, but the basis for the decisions around the 16th of August and the 19th of July did anticipate a wave of cases coming out and then dropping off sort of around the middle of August, sort of hence the 16th of August date. Again, you'll have seen press coverage on this in the last 24 hours. And I do recognise that this is very difficult for you as employers, but it is crucial that people are supported to isolate if they're contacted by NHS Test and Trace or via the app. As I say, that is for the next few weeks, that is the remaining protection that we have in place. Again, you may well have seen press coverage about potential exemptions to this. I would just emphasise that this is going to relate to really a handful of roles, just to, and it's specific roles in specific workplaces where, I won't read it out word for word, but the principles that we're getting towards are sort of a major detrimental impact on the delivery of essential services, questions around loss of life or significant impact on national security. So the bar is really very high for that. And I think in the vast majority of cases, you should plan on the basis that there won't be exemptions for your workplace or sector. The final point I wanted to make, and I'm sure this might be picked up in the advice that you're going to have from Make UK's HR and legal team or your own advisors in-house, is we've had quite a lot of questions around being able to ask employees of their vaccination status. Now, I would refer you to the guidance from the Information Commissioner's Office, and there's also guidance from DHSC on this. But the basic principle is that it is special category data that can be recorded, but it needs to be justified, and you need to treat it in a way that is compliant with GDPR. And from an employment law perspective, that knowledge can't result in differential treatment between employees. So as I say, we might get some questions in relation to the HR implications of that. So those were the points that I wanted to make. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today, and please rest assured that we are listening to your feedback in dialogue with ministers. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Jessica, and particularly thank you to the guidance on what those exemptions mean and what the criteria are, because something that members have been asking particularly strongly over the last 24, 48 hours. But we're now moving on to, as Jessica alluded to, the HR and employment law aspects of what we're talking about today. And we do have one of our Make UK employment law experts with us today in Charlotte Haggerstadt, who I know you'll be sharing your screen and talking us through key considerations now, Charlotte. And I can see your screen, which is bang on time. Thank you. And over to you. You may be on mute.
Thanks very much, Chris, and good morning, everyone. And as Chris said, I'm Charlotte Haggerstadt. I'm one of the principal legal advisors and solicitors here at Make UK. And I think we've already had quite a lot of food for thought this morning. And one thing I think I found really striking were the polls from Verity, indicating that so many of you have seen increasing rates of self-isolation over the last couple of weeks, and even some stoppages of production. And that does fit with actually a lot of the queries we've been getting on our HRL helpline at Make UK from our members. And it was also really great to hear from Bays and Jessica about some of the government's plans. Now, as Chris mentioned, we've had loads of pre-registered questions. So I thought the most useful thing for me to do in the time available. So let's move on my screen. The most useful thing for us to do in the time available would be to pick out some of the main themes that have emerged from these, talking through the HR implications of the issues that you identified in your question with my legal hat on. And the topics that have come up the most frequently in your questions are those on these slides. So that's where I'm going to focus my time. I'm going to spend about 20-25 minutes, and I'm mainly going to be discussing the current guidance and requirements, but of course there'll be the odd place where I'll need to refer to issues that might change over the summer. And I'm also going to let you know how to access some more support and information on all of these topics at the end of the session. So starting then with what seems to be one of the most vexing areas for employers at the moment, and that's how to handle the so-called pingdemic. And it's really good to hear about the lobbying work that Make UK has been doing from Stephen, but also interesting to hear from Jessica that there may be no immediate change to the current rules on self-isolation, and it may not be brought forward. You have to watch that space. Now, I think a good starting point on this topic is first to be clear about the circumstances when there's a specific legal requirement to self-isolate. And that's what's been causing quite a bit of controversy, particularly yesterday in the media. So first off, the regulations, in other words, the statute, sets out expressly that individuals who test positive for COVID-19 are legally obliged to self-isolate. And those regulations also require them to tell their employer that they've tested positive if they're due to come into work. And the same applies if an individual is notified to self-isolate by NHS Test and Trace as a close contact. Now, in both cases, it's an offence for an employer to knowingly allow an individual to attend any place for the purposes of work which isn't the place where they're self-isolating. So that effectively means that someone who's self-isolating at home can work from home if that's feasible, but you as the employer can't allow or require them to attend the workplace during that self-isolation period. And there are fines attached to this if employers are found not to have complied with that. And even company directors can be personally liable, so it's not to be taken lightly. On top of that, individuals who develop symptoms of COVID-19 have to self-isolate for 10 days, and they're encouraged to take a PCR test as soon as possible. And equally, individuals have to self-isolate for 10 days if someone in their household develops symptoms or tests positive. And they'll also almost certainly be contacted by NHS Test and Trace as a close contact if a household member has tested positive. So what about the app then? Well, an individual who is pinged by the app is advised to self-isolate, but this isn't a legal requirement as such. And that's because there's a specific carve out for the app in the regulations. And there's also no legal requirement on the individual to tell their employer that they've been advised to self-isolate via the app. And an employer telling an employee to ignore a ping won't be committing a specific offence under the COVID regs. And the reason for that carve out is I assume that the government recognised the limitations in the accuracy of the app's contact tracing feature. You know, it's based on Bluetooth, and therefore it can't account for things like, the presence of a protective screen or phones being in lockers next to each other. And also just to note as well, as Jess said, that although there have been news stories about exemptions, we're not expecting these exemptions to apply widely to manufacturing members. So if an individual has been pinged by the app, and if they're not required by statute to self-isolate, and if you as the employer aren't committing a specific offence, what should you do about the fact that they've been pinged? And the key issue here really is that you remain under a duty, under the general health and safety duty, to take reasonably practical steps to provide a safe working environment. And that clearly includes steps to minimise the risks from COVID-19 in the workplace. And it's for this reason that we wouldn't advise employers to ignore the app, nor would we advise employers to instruct employees to ignore the app. Neither of those things are going to sit well with your general health and safety obligations. And this is, fits with what Jessica was saying about, the current rises of cases and the risk and so on. I mean, a ping from the app does indicate that the individual has actually had a contact with a confirmed COVID case. And as an employer, for you, there's no way of you being able to identify the context of that ping. If it was in a very, very risky situation with people face to face inside for a long period of time, or whether it was in a less risky case. So, our clear advice is that employers ought to be supporting employees to self-isolate via the app if they're pinged by the app. Another thing which is, probably quite a good idea for employers is to actually consider requiring under your own rules for employees to tell you if they've been pinged. Having said that, there is guidance on the NH COVID-19 app, which recognises that there might be the odd circumstances where it could be sensible to pause the contact tracing element of it. So in accordance with that guidance, it would be possible to request employees that during working hours to pause the contact tracing part of the app if they're working very close to each other, but there are screens between them, for example, or they keep their phones in their lockers, so the phones aren't actually with them at the time. So I think it's clear that manufacturers and those of you on the call are likely to be facing increased COVID-related absence this summer, whether or not it's due to the ping. It may be because more people are testing positive or are contacted by test and trace. And of course, this is going to have a huge operational impact, which we've already talked about. But it's also going to have a big cost impact just in terms of sick pay. And we've heard from Stephen that Make UK is campaigning to keep SSP from day one of self-isolation. But if you also pay company sick pay for self-isolation, which I know a lot of our members do, costs are going to become extremely large really quickly. And we do know that, obviously one possible way of dealing with this, if you haven't done so already, might be to seek to remove or reduce company sick pay for self-isolation. But I just want to point out, potential downsides to this. First, obviously, the normal rules about changing terms of conditions do, of course, apply, and they take quite a long time to implement and get through. And perhaps the more important reason is the possibility that you might end up discouraging employees from self-isolating if they're worried about losing pay because they've had their company sick pay taken away. Now, there are other measures you could consider too, and you'll see the last point on this slide mentions our Make UK vlog and HR guide, and these are designed to help you work through the options for dealing with the problem of rising COVID absences more effectively over the summer, not just in terms of company sick pay or pay, but in other respects. So we'll be sending out a copy of that to all of the delegates after the seminar, the webinar today. And Jessica mentioned the issue of vaccinations, and we've also been finding that quite a live issue on our helplines and amongst our memberships. And members have been asking us about whether they can ask employees to disclose vaccination status for a while now, since vaccines first became available. But we have noticed there's been a really big increase in queries about this in the light of the forthcoming changes to self-isolation rules. And by that, I mean, from mid-August, the change where fully vaccinated individuals won't have to self-isolate if they're identified as a contact of a positive COVID case. In fact, as Jessica said, whether you can ask employees for this information is in some ways the easy bit. I mean, the short answer is yes, you can ask, but if you do keep a record of it, which you will, then you'll need to remember your data protection obligations. And I'll just summarize these quickly before moving on to the rather more complicated employee relations issues around employee vaccination status, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So first of all, you're going to need to identify the purpose for which you need to keep a record of the employee's vaccination status. And an obvious one, once the self-isolation rules change in respect of fully vaccinated individuals, is that having that information would enable you to know who has to self-isolate as a contact if someone else at work tests positive that they've worked near. You'll also need to identify a legal basis for processing, and vaccination status is of course health data, so you'll need both an ordinary and a special category legal basis. And the ordinary legal basis could be that it's necessary to comply with your legal obligation not to allow employees to attend the workplace if they're required by law to self-isolate. And this could also, I think, be your special category legal basis too, as it's a legal obligation in relation to employment. Now, if you're going to use this information about vaccination status for more than just complying with the self-isolation requirement from mid-August, then you'll need to identify other purposes and legal basis in that case. And if you're going to do that, I'd suggest you take a look at our FAQs, which are on our website, and we'll be explaining to you how to find those on our website at the end and in a follow-up email. Now, the other data protection steps you'll need to take are listed on the slide and are also dealt with in our FAQs on the website. But I'll just mention, I think, access and minimization now. So in terms of access, the information about who's been vaccinated, in terms of access to that information, I think you need to make sure you limit this to the people who really need to know about it. So you could say that HR need to know, as they're generally responsible for maintaining that record. But employees' line managers may only need to know when there actually is a positive case in their team, so they can identify who must self-isolate. So be careful about who you allow to see the information about vaccination status. And it's also really important to minimize the information you hold. So for example, if you're going to require employees to give you evidence of having been vaccinated, the principle of data minimization would suggest that you don't keep a copy of the evidence, just a note that HR have seen it. Now, the NHS app does include a COVID-19 pass at the moment, but this doesn't seem to be strictly designed for use by employers, and not everyone has the app. So I think actually maybe a point for Jessica is that it would be, I think, quite helpful to have some clarity from government about how employers and employees should evidence vaccination status. So that might be something worth thinking about. Also, just finally here, just to flag the question of what you should do if an employee won't tell you whether they've been vaccinated and you've asked. Well, of course, you can't force an employee to share the information with you. But if they won't tell you, then for the purposes of the self-isolation rules, you will have to assume that they aren't vaccinated, and that if they have had a close contact, that they do need to self-isolate and can't come into work. And that's, I'm talking about post the change on the 16th of August rather than today. So moving on now to the rather more difficult issues for employers, the employment relations issues that relate to vaccination. Now, a big question is whether employers can require employees to be vaccinated. And this is what the media have been talking about as a no jab, no job policy. And essentially what they're meaning is whether for existing employees, can employers take action against an employee, perhaps moving them to a different role or disciplining them or dismissing them if they're not vaccinated. So we do know that there's going to be introduced legislation coming, which will require people who work in the care sector to be fully vaccinated. But for workplaces where this legislation doesn't apply, I think imposing a blanket no jab, no job type policy for employees is going to be really problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, is it a reasonable management instruction to ask or require staff to take a vaccine when it's available? Well, of course, it will depend in part on the circumstances, but I think it's generally going to be unlikely that you'll be able to establish that requiring vaccination is a reasonable management instruction in an office or factory setting, if other health and safety measures could protect staff and customers. And in addition, instructing employees to get the vaccine in order to avoid self-isolation absences is, I think, going to be rather fraught with difficulty. There may, of course, be the odd exceptional situation, so do take advice if you are considering making vaccination compulsory. Second, any no jab, no job policy could give rise to some indirect discrimination risks. For example, disability discrimination in relation to individuals who have certain medical conditions who might not be able to have the vaccine. There's religion and belief discrimination, and that might be if an employee refuses to be vaccinated on the basis of their religious beliefs, or say if an employer who is an ethical vegan refuses the vaccine because it was tested on animals. But I think it's less likely that someone who has standalone anti-vaxxer beliefs would be protected, but of course, there isn't any case law on this point as yet. Age discrimination in relation to younger employees, I guess that's a possibility if you were to impose a requirement to vaccinate on employees, and some haven't yet had the opportunity to have both doses of the vaccine. Although I guess the risk of age discrimination is going to diminish, as younger people in the population do get their second vaccine. You'll also need to consider unfair dismissal liability. So if employees are dismissed for refusing to comply with a mandatory vaccination policy, or even potentially constructive unfair dismissal claims, if an employee feels strongly enough to resign in response to the vaccination requirement, or say an instruction to work from home or to move to an alternative role. Now, given all of these issues, we generally recommend encouraging rather than requiring employees to be vaccinated when vaccines offered to them. And this could involve things like sharing factual information with them about the vaccine and the benefits it can provide. And you can also consider allowing employees paid time off work to attend appointments and paying them their usual full pay if they're off sick with vaccine side effects, for example. And one final point to flag on this slide relates to the potential really for tensions to arise between employees. The issues are likely to be particularly sensitive if protected characteristics under the Equality Act are concerned, particularly, whether or not, in fact, the vaccination is mandatory. So, for example, what if you have an employee whose partner or child is clinically extremely vulnerable and they get into a dispute with a colleague who's decided not to be vaccinated for religious reasons? Employees are going to need to handle those situations with quite a lot of care and sensitivity. And we recommend that as they arise, you seek advice on the particular circumstances, because the best way to respond is going to vary depending on exactly what's happened and the background information. Now, Verity and Stephen talked about employee COVID-19 testing and the free lateral flow test devices, which used to be available for workplace testing before the 19th of July. And I did see that almost all of you in the poll did want the provision of those free tests to continue. If that doesn't happen, there's going to be a number of options left for you as employers if you are carrying out workplace testing. So if you've been operating workplace testing to date, you could, of course, continue to do so, but fund the tests yourself when the current test that you've got to run out. Alternatively, you could choose to stop testing altogether, or ask employees to access the lateral flow test for themselves and test at home. And that's still a possibility, because free tests are still available to individuals, if not employers. Individuals can order them online or collect them from pharmacies and test centres. So if employees test themselves at home, as an employee, you're going to have a lot less visibility and control over the whole process. So from a practical perspective, it's likely to be a lot more difficult to enforce a requirement to take COVID-19 tests than if the employer operated testing at the workplace. So, and if employers have operated workplace testing on a mandatory basis and are now moving to having employees test themselves at home, they're going to need to decide whether to still attempt to make this mandatory or whether to move to a voluntary basis only. And even if testing is on a voluntary basis, employers are going to need to decide whether they want to ask for evidence that the employees have conducted the test, or simply take it on trust that they've done so. So if employers do ask for evidence, what's that going to be? Is it going to be a photograph of the lateral flow test device? How do you know when it was done, who did it? Or might it be a screenshot of the results logged onto the NHS results logging website? Now, I think possibly for some of you, the next question will be, if you want to require testing on a mandatory basis, what do you do if an employee refuses to comply? So I'm now going to move on to talk about setting your COVID-19 rules and how to handle the enforcement of those rules. So as Verity and Stephen mentioned earlier, most of you have said that, or most of our members have said that they will be continuing with at least some or all of their pre-Freedom Day rules in terms of COVID safety, things like encouraging mask wearing, and continuing with social distancing and so on. And in addition, although the instruction to work from home where possible has been lifted, we do know that lots of employers are choosing to continue with a degree of home working as well moving forwards. Now we're about to hear from David from the HSE, who's going to talk more about the expectations of employers in view of the move away from the government imposed restrictions towards employer and individual responsibility. So I'm not going to dwell on exactly how that works now, but I would just flag that once you've decided on what your workplace COVID safety measures are, which could be, for example, measures to do with mandatory testing, it's really important that you communicate very clearly to employees what it is you require them to do, which measures are compulsory, and what it is you expect them to do. And that's about what voluntary measures you're encouraging them to adopt. And the distinction there between compulsory and voluntary is, going to be quite important to make. So I'll move on now to consider how you handle employees who don't cooperate with the rules that you have set, whatever those rules are. So from the queries we've been having at Make UK, we're finding that employees who don't want to comply with COVID-19 working safety rules tend to fall within two camps. First, they're those who are worried about the risks of COVID, and they don't think your measures go far enough to protect employees or themselves in particular. And if you're relaxing any measures that you've had in place before the 19th of July, and as case numbers rise, you might find that more of these employees who have concerns about safety, and there could even be some who might refuse to attend work as a result. And we covered this category of employees in the FAQs on our website. But today I'm going to talk more about the other category, namely those who aren't worried about the COVID-19 risks and don't want to comply with some or all of your COVID rules. So this could be someone who doesn't comply with, say, your social distancing rules, or doesn't want to comply with mandatory testing rules. So if your risk assessment recommends a particular mandatory measure to ensure safety in the workplace in relation to COVID, it's very likely to be a reasonable instruction. And it will be very likely, I think, for you to be able to require employees to comply with that. And it doesn't matter whether you could have chosen to implement a different, more or less restrictive measure. So if you encounter an employee who's not complying with a particular mandatory rule that you've set, obviously initially the best thing to do is to have a conversation with them about it. Make sure they understand what the rule is and the consequences for failing to comply, and listening to any reasons that they might give for refusing. So for example, if you require employees to wear face coverings in the workplace, some employees might refuse because they've got a medical condition that makes wearing them difficult, and that would be useful information for you to know, and you'd probably take a different stance if that were the case. Now, if you don't manage to resolve any issues informally, you're going to be entitled to treat that employee's refusal to comply with your reasonable instruction as a disciplinary matter. And that's the same as for other health and safety breaches. But you will need to make sure you follow a fair disciplinary procedure. So for example, you might be tempted to immediately send an employee home, but you just do need to remember that suspension shouldn't just be a knee-jerk reaction. You should take advice on whether the issue is serious enough to suspend them on the spot. And much like other disciplinary scenarios, the extent of the investigation needed will very much depend on the individual case, as will the appropriate sanction, whether it's a warning or potentially dismissal. And you'll also need to take into account mitigating circumstances. But I think what's probably unique about some issues which might arise from employees who are not complying with your COVID rules is that they may be making clear that they never intend to comply and that they intend to continue to breach a particular rule on an ongoing basis. So it's not a one-off. And in that case, I think imposing warnings isn't going to be as effective, and you may end up having to dismiss someone in those circumstances. Now, finally, I've touched on tensions between employees in the context of vaccinations, but it's also worth flagging that tensions could arise between employees that have different views on other COVID-19 risks and have different views about the importance of complying with a variety of your workplace safety measures. Now, of course, if the employee is breaching a mandatory rule that you've imposed, you'll deal with it as a disciplinary matter. But it's going to be trickier to handle a situation where one employee is refusing to comply with a voluntary measure, but other employees don't feel comfortable working with them. And I think as a first step, constructive dialogue is always going to be the best initial approach. But you do need to make clear to employees that they've got to treat each other with respect, even where their views differ. There may sometimes be practical workarounds for issues that arise, but I'm afraid the approach you're going to take in a particular situation will vary depending on the facts. And I'd suggest you take advice if you find yourself in that situation. So this slide is my final slide, and it just sets out some details of how Make UK can support you in dealing with the repercussions of Freedom Day. And we'll include all of this information about how to access our resources and how to access advice and support from us in a follow-up email. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm going to hand back to Chris now.
Absolutely, thank you, Charlotte, and especially for the comprehensive advice and guidance to members. And just to reiterate, we'll share Charlotte's slides after this session. And while we're lingering on Charlotte's final slide, please do make sure you're making use of Make UK's Coronavirus Hub, and all the guidance and FAQ pages are all available there to check and log into. But we've still got some time left, thankfully, to talk to both David and Alex from the Health and Safety Executive. A brilliant double act. I think Alex, in terms of leading up the COVID sector policy at the HSE, but also David in terms of being the principal inspector for general manufacturing. So two absolute experts in this area and can give us a real rundown from the health and safety perspective, which Charlotte very much referred to. So over to you, Alex, and I can see you've shared your slides already.
Well, Charlotte's stolen a lot of my thunder, which is good because that saves me time. So I'll crack through these slides as quickly as I can, assuming I can get the slides to move on. There you go. Right.
Do you just very quickly wanted to move into presentation mode, Alex? If you just click the, just right click and go. Maybe not there. Hang on. If you go, let me take control.
Ah, okay.
Brilliant. There you are.
Oh, yeah. Can you see that? Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Alex.
Go on. Move on. Oh. Oh.
There we go.
There we go. Right. There you go.
Thank you.
So this is quite. I'm focusing a lot on England here because obviously that's where Step 4 has happened, and the approach will be similar in Scotland and Wales as those move through. Because I appreciate some of you may have some premises which are in England and some in Scotland, so there is a slightly different position at this point in time. The other thing is to remember is also that within England, whilst many of the laws, COVID laws have gone, there are still some emergency public health powers in place. So if there were areas where there were major outbreaks and so forth, there could be reimposition of some aspects of social distancing, etc., at a public health level. So to really sort of focus on what do you need to do different now than you've been doing before. And I think as Charlotte mentioned, we're sort of moving now from a sort of prescriptive approach to a risk-based approach. So the 1 meter plus sort of elements of social distancing, those are all gone in England as legal requirements. You need to continue controlling your risks and review and update your risk assessment. And the guidance produced by BEIS, the Safer Workplace Guidance, view that as basically a question set to take you through that process in terms of, should I do this? Do I need to do that? Does this make sense in my workplace? Different workplaces are different, but it's likely that many of those controls in there on those three main areas, which are the three main areas to focus on still for controlling the virus, are ventilation, regular cleaning and good hand hygiene, are likely to be relevant to most businesses that are out there, most manufacturers out there. The other element, of course, is you should also consider what additional measures you might need to take or you wish to take to limit the number of people your workers are in contact with. And I saw from the survey that many of you are saying, well, actually at the moment, we're not going to shift hugely from where we were because we want to be sure before we make those changes. And we understand that because obviously there's going to be quite further cost and disruption in removing measures, screens and barriers that you've put in place already. The other thing I would say is, if you in your risk assessment conclude that a certain control or measure is needed to reduce the risk of transmission between your workers, we will expect those controls to be supervised and monitored if they're in place. So it's that question of, you're either putting a control in place or you're not putting a control in place. If you decide to keep some things because you don't think it's there as a transmission control, but you're doing it because you think it's there to raise confidence, you need to be quite clear about that and not say that it's a risk control measure within your risk assessment. Because if we see risk control measures, we will expect them to be appropriately applied. What we really don't want to do is encourage people to start ignoring signs, barriers, and so forth that are in place, because obviously that can have wider implications on other wider health and safety issues as well. And obviously in this time of change, consulting with your workforce on these health and safety issues, getting their involvement and their engagement and keeping those lines of communication open are really important, because this is a time of change and a lot of people are feeling concerned about, what does this mean for me? What are the measures in my workplace now? What should I do? The guidance is obviously, the key guidance is the guidance that's been produced by BEIS. On the HSE website, we've updated all our web pages to reflect the Step 4 changes. References to social distance are removed. For Wales and Scotland, we've got links to where you can find that information for Scotland and Wales. The ventilation guidance has also been updated. It includes guidance on the use of carbon dioxide monitors. And just to make it quite clear, we are not expecting every business up and down the country to suddenly rush out and buy a carbon dioxide monitor. Please, please, please look at the guidance, and it sets out there where they can be useful and where they're less likely to be useful. Because with a carbon dioxide monitor, you're using exhaled carbon dioxide to act as a proxy for how effective ventilation is. So don't just rush out and buy a carbon dioxide monitor. Read the guidance first and find out, actually, will that really be useful for you? The other thing we've also got there now that went up on the 19th is we've got some examples of how different businesses, the sort of practical steps that have been taken to improve ventilation. Have a look there. It's got to be said, many general manufacturing workplaces, and in the nicest possible terms, your businesses tend to leak like your buildings tend to leak like a sieve ventilation wise, and you tend to have large areas with limited numbers of people in. So quite often ventilation general ventilation is not a key issue, but think about those areas where you've got more people crowded together. The other thing is, obviously, we know that various sector groups are producing more specific guidance. The reason I flagged construction was just because I think they were the first one off the block to sort of start producing their own guidance. So there are other bits of guidance out there, but sort of if you look at those core bits of guidance, those should give you a really clear steer. There are some exceptions to social distancing. I don't think that will be relative. Those would be particularly relevant to any of the Make UK members. I've listed them here, but they tend to be, ports of entry, health and social care establishments. So at this stage of the pandemic, what is HSE doing? We will still be addressing COVID-19 control measures as part of all our visits when we're going, either we're going specifically to look at COVID, or we're there to do with just general health and safety issues and concerns. The risk of forklift trucks and falling off things and things falling on you, they all still remain. We're still pursuing those issues, but we will also be looking at COVID control measures as part of that. We're also going to be continuing to support public health bodies in outbreaks where they think there's an aspect that's linked to the workplace. And our spot check program is also continuing as well. And we'll be focusing that attention on those parts of the country that have still got higher rates of COVID-19. So that's sort of in a nutshell where we are. So keep your risk assessment up to date. Use the BEIS guidance. The HSE website is being updated. We will still continue pursuing these issues, but it has to be said that what we've found in the main is the vast majority of workplaces have actually been compliant, and where there have been deficiencies, there've been minor issues, and it's been more an issue that's been addressed by advice. We're finding very few sort of people in the manufacturing industries who are ignoring COVID-19 or are not taking appropriate measures. I'll breathe now. David, anything to add to that?
No, just really to reiterate that last point, even when we've looked at outbreaks, etc., the workplaces do seem to have a high compliance level with control measures. So, and it's something that the health and safety sort of framework is about managing risk. And most companies, they do their best to manage risk, and something as incredibly important as this, they've been able to sort of change those skills to manage a different kind of risk, a risk that is not usual within the workplace, but many companies out there have those skills that they've honed over many years dealing with different types of risk, but still well versed in risk management and risk control.
Oh, and I should have said, we don't care if your risk assessment is a separate standalone COVID risk assessment or it's just part of your overall risk assessment process. We just want you to have done the risk assessment, and even more importantly, to have implemented the controls you've identified.
Brilliant, thank you, Alex and David there. And we have now come to a close of the session. We do have a couple of minutes, so I'm happy to close this early, given that we had originally planned to only take an hour and we gave ourselves a little bit more time, so happy to close a little bit early. But also thank you very much for the feedback we're receiving in the chat. And just to note, we are also keeping a log of questions that have been asked today to take it away for government, people like David and Alex at the HSE and Jessica within BEIS, but also within our guidance to make sure we can be reflecting answers to the questions you've all asked. So thank you very much to all of our guest speakers and for sharing their expertise and insight. David, Alex, Jessica, Charlotte, Verity, and of course, Stephen. A recording of the session and the materials will be circulated to everybody that's joined us. And just a reminder from what Charlotte was alluding to and highlighted from Make UK's perspective, we do have a huge number of FAQs on our website, which are updated daily to reflect the changes that keep happening. But also we have a number of HR checklists and guides in terms of returning to the workplace, absence management, quarantine and overseas holidays requirements, and also a template for hybrid and home working policies as well. But also our team of health and safety experts separately can also provide and conduct risk assessments and workplace audits to make sure you're in line with all the guidance that we've mentioned earlier today, and particularly Alex and David referred to. So I'm happy to close things there and wish everybody a fantastic rest of their day.